Hey everyone, welcome to episode 2 of the Three Pillars podcast, brought to you by Conduit and Capcom. This week we're taking a little bit of a different approach where we're going to dive into the business side of games from Capcom's point of view especially. And another note, apologies, I forgot to record on one of the microphones in the session, so you're going to hear my voice from the backup mic, which means it's not going to be as high quality as our usual episodes. We still hope you enjoy. And a quick disclaimer, the opinions on this podcast are those of the individuals themselves and do not reflect the views of the companies those individuals represent. And let's head into the episode and let us know your feedback. Ikimashou. So, on to another episode of Three Pillars podcast.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
Here we are.
Yeah. We just we're filming in Osaka and we just had Mexican food for lunch. So what did you guys think of that?
Yeah, no, it was good. It was good. It was good. It was very filling. Yeah.
I think that was probably one of my first times having the Mexican food in Japan. But yeah, like,
is it close to like home? I guess taste wise.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, it's like I grew up. In Palm Springs in California is probably like 50% of my community was like Latino, and so like this burrito tasted like when I had it after high school. We would go after school.
Oh right, yeah.
How did this get all the way to Osaka?
Yeah.
I haven't had this in a long time.
Yeah.
So, So I think on today's episode we're going to dig more into the business side of games, and so. Probably going to be flipping it over to Okabe-san and Thomas from Capcom to walk us through just, I think a lot of listeners are going to know kind of the Capcom name. They all have a favorite title or two in mind, whether that's Devil May Cry, Monster Hunter, Street Fighter, the list goes on, Mega Man, a lot of IP to pull from. And, I think one thing that we heard from our audience that folks wanted to hear about was, Capcom is a Japanese company, but obviously it's built a global name. Like, I grew up in California, obviously was playing Capcom games probably when I was 6 or 7 years old. So it's like, what does it take what is it like to build a game in Japan for a global audience? So, I think both Thomas and Okabe-san have worked on a range of titles, but starting out, how would you kind of describe Capcom's strategy when it comes to global releases and just thinking about marketing and audiences in general?
Yeah, very good question.
Yeah, very good question.
基本的に、Capcom
Of course, as the disclaimer at the start of every episode says, this is of course using our experience, so not like as representative of Capcom, but Okabe-san will kind of explain more about how he believes this is probably how all the big developers in Japan kind of do it.
本当に今日本の
Yeah, so looking at the regions, from Japanese developers' perspective at least, I guess. The biggest market is the US, and the second one is Europe. Of course, many different countries, and you can say this country is bigger than that, but let's just say Europe as a whole right now is second. And then third is Asia, which includes Japan, and lately China has also, of course, been a big market. So when we think about that, usually the biggest market is always the US, so we really aim for that, look at that the most. And what Okabe-san also personally felt is that when he entered the game business, the sales in Japan were still a lot bigger than they were nowadays. Like when you look at, for example, the sales units here in Japan, the titles that just sell over 1 million units in Japan themselves have probably declined, or I think you can count on one hand lately, or like the titles that sell more than 1 million.
Only Pokemon or Monster Hunter.
Yeah, Monster Hunter. Yeah. Very big titles only do those numbers still.
Yeah, do you think that's because there's just a lot more games available for people to play, or why do you think that's changed?
市場だけで言うと、
Yeah, so first, just looking at demographics, a lot of people know that Japan's population is not that young anymore. So just less young people than there used to be. So people that are into those, console games or like PC games like that, higher, like no, not mobile. The other element is, of course, now there are so many things to entertain you that it already becomes a very specific choice to choose games over something else. So now you have Netflix, now you have mobile games. Users have a lot more venues where they can spend their time. So it becomes more difficult for us to get that mind share as well. And just talking a bit more about like the specific market in Japan as well, or the needs. Nintendo, of course, brought out the Switch, the handheld gaming system, which we believe is a very clever choice looking at the Japanese market, because we're not really sure about the numbers, but like I guess 50, maybe 60, maybe even 70% of people that are gaming on handheld devices here in Japan. So it's very uncommon to have like a set PC or like a console wired to the TV to play that way. If you're in Japan, if you go to like the big electronic stores, it's like Nintendo has like a huge section where Nintendo and their handhelds are very well represented, and then there's a little bit to the side. There's like the other console or like the other hardware. So it does kind of show where the focus lies of the Japanese users for sure.
Interesting. Do you think that's, I guess, Nintendo trying to push that? Like, have they kind of like purchased the space in the stores? Do you think that's actually based off demand? So there is like a very strong demand for like Switch style games versus like the traditional consoles?
もうシンプルにデマンドだと思います。私たちも量販店の人に対してゲームが新発売になるときには当然そのプレゼンするんですね。ユニットをいっぱい買ってもらうために。でその話をするときにもやっぱりもうゲームの本数をもうどんどん低く抑えていってるなっていうのは感じますし、でその中でもやっぱり売れるもの、当然ああいう量販店に行くのでファミリーだし、ファミリーに売れるものが優先されるっていうふうになると、どうしても任天堂が強くなるっていうのはもうすごくなんですかね、市場に沿ったものが投影されてると思いますね。
Yeah, so it's more from a market perspective, most likely, because of course when we release titles as well, we talk to some of those big stores or big chains. We give them presentations as well, but what we see from the numbers is, and what they order the most is that they're definitely looking for titles that appeal to families. And when you think about electronic stores nowadays, or people who buy games in bigger electronic stores, it's not like the hardcore audience. It's more families who want to buy a game for their kids. So it makes sense that is the bigger part of the section, because the hardcore gamers probably will just get it off the PlayStation Store or like Steam or Xbox, where on the digital storefronts themselves anyway. They don't go all the way to the stores themselves either, perhaps. Yeah, no, that was all I wanted to say. My parents never were into video games or didn't really grow up with it, so it was always like, why are you, which was funny because like my parents spent like maybe 3 hours watching TV every day, and then I'd be playing 2 hour games for 2 hours, and they're like, why are you all 2 hours playing video games? And they're like, well, you're watching TV for 3 hours. Like it's not like one is better than the other. It's not like
right.
But it's just kind of how it's perceived, I guess. And I do notice that with my daughter that like she doesn't get to play that often, but like every Saturday morning she can play like some actual games on like TV, like on the Switch or something like that.
Okay.
And she is into that. So yeah, which is interesting. When I went to India to do like some market research, what was very interesting, like as you said, like here in Japan and in the West, like the parents are already into gaming, or it's like more of a thing. And in India, because the parents there haven't grown up with that yet, so like all of the college students that I talked to, they were playing games at home, not on the street, and like away from their parents in their room, make sure people don't find out about it, or their parents don't find out about it. Because if they find out about it, they're like, why are you wasting your time with games and stuff? So it's like they're a little bit like from a generation, it's like still the previous generation that kind of has to fight for like games are not a waste of time, or games are, just any other form of entertainment. So that was really interesting to see.
Yeah, true. I was also I was in Beijing a couple months ago and was talking with a cab driver. We were just chit chatting. Oh, are you in town? I was like, work in technology or video games, maybe some companies. And I was kind of curious. I was like, hey, like, what do you think of video games? Like, do you play any? And it was pretty strong negative response.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He was maybe like 50, 55 years old. And yeah, his first response was just, kids play too much. It's like, I think he was talking from personal experience with like people in his own family. He feels like it's not like good use of time, or like what like he would be doing if like he were young again.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's in the US as well, but I feel like you don't really hear as much of it maybe. So yeah. Yeah, so with India, then is that, with your trip, is that something that like Capcom has been thinking about, or like, what was the trip about?
Yeah, so of course, we are planning on expanding to more markets. I think we have said that publicly as well, so I think it's okay to talk about. No, no, but we have talked about how we need to, because we have the US audience, as Okabe-san mentioned before. We have the existing markets, and of course, we need to do our efforts to grow there as well. But of course, there are many markets now, especially Southeast Asia or like India, where gaming is slowly coming up. Like it's not something like, oh, okay, next year we'll be selling tons of title, we're making lots of profit there, but it is slowly coming up. So it's kind of like preliminary work to see what the industry is like right now. That's why we went to India, to kind of see like, hey, because the internet is now everywhere as well, and those economies and cultures, they are, since there is no existing infrastructure, they're sometimes faster to adapting to like new like internet or like new trends. So it does make sense to already do the homework now and then see how we can further penetrate that market in the future.
That makes sense. Kind of like leapfrog internet, where it's like some countries they'll have significantly faster internet than like countries that got it earlier.
Yeah.
Because then they laid all this infrastructure built for an older system.
Right.
Whereas now they can. Yeah, I remember living in San Francisco in 2016 when I was at Twitch. It was just a known thing. It was like San Francisco had notoriously poor internet, surprisingly, because it relied on, they of course got internet pretty early.
Right.
And so, but it was then still relying on the old infrastructure. And so then, the office was good, but you go to some places or cafes or your home, it was really hard to get good internet at home.
Really?
So, yeah, it was kind of surprising. So Okabe-san, worked on several titles, maybe like, what's an example of, on something that you were working on that, when you were thinking about taking it to market, like what, like any specifics, like, maybe the name of the game and like top markets and like how you guys approached it?
カプコンに入る前
So first, there are two ways of thinking about it. First is like if you're creating a title in already an existing franchise, and then the other if you're trying to create something like a new IP, something completely new. And with the new IP, it's definitely difficult to create a global hit because it just doesn't have an existing install base, so to speak, or existing user base. What Okabe-san really noticed when doing, for example, press tours for existing titles, there's already like a user base and people that love the franchise so much. So he's really thankful to like the legends that have created other titles in the past franchise, because there's already interest in it to a certain extent. There are already people around the world that know it, so it becomes easier to connect with. But talking a bit more about like how to approach these different areas, that's actually something that you'd like to explain next.
2つ大きくその考える
So first, maybe more than just thinking about how am I going to make this a global hit, first you need to think about how am I going to make this a global product. So especially nowadays, with a lot of like the how to say in English, sorry, in Japanese you say compliance mondai, but like I make you like politically correct. That is the word that I was looking for. Yes, politically correct. Yes. So before, at the start of Okabe-san's career, like as long as you steered clear from religion and politics, it was pretty much free game on whatever you wanted to create. But nowadays, we need to think about, can I, for example, how the way female characters dress, or like, can I use this expression, and is that not like something different that we need to think about? Especially coming from Japan, where globalization, it's not as globalized as the rest of the world. It sometimes is difficult to think about that, because some of the ways that are accepted or like that are considered like fun or exciting for in Japan are typical for Japan, but that might be deemed a little bit disrespectful towards other cultures. So the baseline is first like, let's clear that and let's think about those things. And if we can't do this, then let's do this, which is of course good because you're selling to a global audience. But at the same time, it becomes more difficult to make something unique or like freely what you want to make, I guess, how to say, or maybe something more niche, I guess, what you could say, which adds some challenges.
でそれがあった上でじゃあグローバル
Yeah, so and actually, to be completely upfront, how do we want to make this a hit in this specific region? Is that something that you're thinking about? Not really, actually. Like, because you can look at the data and you can say, okay, maybe we can try to do something to appeal to that market, but in most cases, it doesn't really pan out the way you plan to. So maybe it's better to focus on what do the creators really want to make and go from there. Because that has a bigger chance of becoming like a more global IP or like globally loved thing, if it comes from people that really cared about the process and like how thought about what they wanted to make more than instead of trying to appeal to like a certain market.
でなぜそう思うかっていうと多分ベース
Yeah, so of course you have cultural differences. Like for example, in Japan, characters have like bigger eyes and like more cuter design. While for example, in US, they're muscular, very muscular men, and so on and so forth. But pretty cool that kind of image. It doesn't really like when thinking about creating games. It doesn't really matter that much. Rather, when Okabe-san had like the opportunity to go around the world for like press tours twice in his career. And what he noticed was that, like, of course, while the countries and the cultures are all different, like the people, the big core fans, they're all kind of the same. They're all like the same fans, the same otaku you say in Japanese. Like, they're basically the same borderless, basically. So like, and the things that they appreciated about the things that they had created were the same globally, or like felt the same attraction to that. So for example, you can have more people that are more into anime and like people that are more into American comics, and of course they're in that fandom. I guess there are different types, and but if you want to play to your core audience, you just got to make what you enjoy, and what you think is a good idea, and have that dialogue of like, I think this is great, what do you guys think, have sort of that dialogue. And if you do that, at least we'll be able to appeal to that core audience that has been with you for a long time.
でこれもカプコンに入ってから思ったというか、
So what he learned most about after joining Capcom is when creating games, you really have to think about your core audience and what they want to see. And that's basically how your creative process starts. And then once you have something that the core fan base that has already been there and that loves your product is there, or you have something that appeals to those people, then you can start to think afterwards, or like, how am I going to get other people into this game or into the genre? And that's basically the way to make something fun and interesting, especially with games. Like if you try to appeal too much to a different demographic and not your core audience, that's probably not the way to create a good product.
それを一番感じたのがそのバイオハザードのその
What he learned, for example, also with the Resident Evil series, of course, you have Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and then 4 was probably the biggest one, then 5 came after that. When Okabe-san joined, we were creating, Capcom was rather creating Resident Evil 6. And one of the design philosophies there was to try to appeal to a broader audience even. From a sales perspective, Resident Evil 6 did well, but when you talk to core fans of the series, they're like, yeah, 6 is not my favorite. It's not really Resident Evil. That again made him realize that you really have to play to that specific core audience who's been with you. And that's also when the development on Resident Evil 7 started, there were lots of internal discussions about, hey, what is Resident Evil? What is the core? And I think that's the difficulty of developing games as well, is like you have to make something that appeals to a core audience, but at the same time, also something that a lot of people can buy or has like broader appeal, which is kind of where two things conflict a little bit. Those two objectives conflict a little bit, which is why it's difficult. But currently, he believes that in game development, just focus on your core audience for now, and then go from there.
そこからの体系として今の私の考え方
Just first creating something for that main target audience who has been with you, and then afterwards figuring out how to go from there is, I believe, the most effective way right now of developing video games. And our current department, what we're trying to do is maybe looking more like how can we spread that to new users, to other people, which is one of the main missions that we're working on.
このポッドキャストではあまりこう特定の名前とか特定のタイトルあまり使わないよ。
Since it's a public podcast, he won't go into details about what title or what the director was, but like a legendary person at Capcom as well that Okabe-san was working together with. They were at Gamescom. They had never mentioned that the director would be there or not for the promotion of that title, but there were tons of fans, and when they noticed that he was there, like the entire back catalog of like all the titles from that series, like they had the packages with them in order to be signed. Of course, they all wanted to take a picture and so on and so forth. There was this big guy with like lots of tattoos and like cool guy, I guess. How to say what he was surprised about, like when taking a picture with that director, like his hands were shaking tremendously. Like so he was so like nervous to be together with that director. So that's when he thought like, okay, for these people I really have to do my best in order to bring out something, a new good entry in the series, or like a good product that the core audience will definitely enjoy.
なんでその人たちにアピールができてると当然その人
If you treat that core audience very well, then they become sort of an evangelist, and they will tell their friends that it's really good. So then it spreads from there again as well. So from that perspective, it really he really felt like, yeah, I have to take care of the core audience, make sure that they're happy with the product that we're putting out.
Yeah, interesting. Is there, like, when you're going through that planning as Capcom, was there like a certain number of fans or core audience that you look for, and then I guess then any maybe advice for any indie game developers that are in the audience, like how is there, like, should they put a metric against that, or like what is that number?
ビジネスの側面でいくと当然その
Of course, we have several internal numbers of like in this region there are around this many Resident Evil fans, so on and so forth. And so based on that, we can of course determine what our sales targets are going to be for newer titles, as well as figure out, oh, this is our main target, so this is a good release date, and so on and so forth. Direct advice to indie developers is a little bit different because of course we have so many franchises, so we already have like a back catalog of sales numbers where we can see, okay, this title did this much in this region, so we can estimate that for the next title this much in this region as well. So but for indie developers, of course, they don't have that data, or they don't have past titles out in the market. Or even for us, when we release new IP, it's always difficult to assume like, hey, how is this gonna do in each market? Because we don't really have that back catalog of data that we can look back onto.
でこれは、ユーザー
Yeah, so what he feels when talking to lots of indie developers is that they've become maybe a bit too much like big publishers, where they're very market driven. In order to have a hit, I need to make something in this genre because there have been other examples, there have been other successes. And it's probably easier to get funding because they know there's a market for that, which of course makes sense, but at the same time it goes maybe a little bit against the core of what indies could do, because of course if you try to make a game in a genre that is already very well represented, it's very difficult to outdo the bigger developers or the more experienced developers. So it might actually be better to just try first on focusing on something that you really want to create, whether there's a market for it or not, or whether you've looked at the numbers or not, and maybe just go like, I don't know if this is even a fun idea for a video game, but let's just try and make it and see if it works and see if it doesn't work, and maybe go at it from that perspective a little bit more.
やっぱりゲームとかってその日用品
Going back on like what we see as indie developers, or the strength rather, is like trying to do many new things, or just gathering people around you, making something that you really believe in, that you think is interesting, and then building on top of that. When we were at Gamescom with you last year as well, we had the opportunity to talk to someone from that created BattleBit, and what stood out there as well is like, of course there were some uncertainties about what the future of the game itself is, but like, well, we made what we thought is going to be interesting and going to be fun, so they made it more first for themselves than for other people, which of course comes with the necessary uncertainty, but at the same time they can stand behind what they have created. And when we listen to other people's pitches as well, like if the people with the stance of like, well, I don't know what you guys think about it, but at least I made what I want to make, that were usually the titles that felt a little bit stronger. And then when people were thinking too much about like, hey, I need to sell this, or I need to get funding for this, I need to find an audience for this. Because of course games aren't really like, how to say, they're not something that you use daily, and it's more of a thing that is has a niche audience, but in that niche audience you can get like 100 out of 100, or you can really hit their core and what they're looking for. So that's kind of what games are about. Yeah.
でもし自分がインディーの会社を
So if Okabe-san were now to go back and like create his own indie developing studio, what he would do, instead of like trying to think about, oh, how can I reach a global audience, it'd be more about like, how can I go into a certain niche, creating something that I'm really passionate about, and like start with maybe like just 10 people from all around the world, but 10 people that I can build a really strong connection with, or build really strong fans around, and then start building out from there how I can keep doing that on a returning basis.
So it's a little bit of people first, then it's a focus on really what you want to build within this team. One term that I think maybe people that have worked in tech startups before, it's a bit of a no-no, or something that is discouraged. It's like, oh, you don't want to be a solution seeking a problem where it's like build a piece of software and then you go out and you're trying to find a customer for it. But maybe with games, it's actually, this isn't a one-to-one comparison because games are a work of art and there's a lot more uniqueness and creativity that can come from that versus like something you're building for people only to purchase as like a tool that they would use to append their life. So is that, would you say that's like, you know, games and maybe startups or other types of software technology are different that way?
その自分の
Going back to like the first program that Okabe-san even wrote, was like was just programming something to make like a friend next to him laugh. And so it's easier to start with like people around you and like how can I make them enjoy this or what could be interesting to them instead of like thinking about like sort of a faceless global audience. It's very difficult to imagine how you're going to appeal to them. So it might actually make sense to just think about more people in your vicinity and how you are going to appeal to them or like how you're going to how are they going to enjoy it when you show them this or when they play this, and instead of, you know, because in marketing you have like the persona and so on and so forth, but maybe, and of course there needs to be some market driven conversations as well if you're, you know, if you're making a company, if you're doing this for a job, but like maybe start just from you and your surroundings and what can be interesting, and then start thinking maybe further about like the personas and how to make it more global.
でそれをもう少し
Of course, the basis still remains like ideally creating something that you'd like to create, but of course you have to kind of be genius level, I guess, in order to, if the market really accepts that. So of course maybe another point of that you can start from is like, hey, me and my friends, we really like this type of game in this genre, let's try to make, how could we evolve that or how could we change that and appeal more to that, to the people that like that genre as well. Of course, then you also have to be careful that you're not just mimicking something that's already existing in the market and really, I think we had a conversation a couple of days ago where like really make it yourself instead of trying to just like ape someone else, so to speak.
Yeah.
But that's maybe also a thing that you could start like, oh, people that play this genre are usually into this or they like this element, so maybe how can I evolve that, or how would they like it if I did this instead of that, and like change that a little bit around. But ideally, you know, you start with the point of like, hey, this is just something that I really want to make.
I see. So almost like if it's a scale on one side, it's like, okay, you're just copy paste exactly what a game is, and then to the far right is like, oh, something, the game totally different that you're just following a trend you'd heard of, but you're not as familiar. You maybe want to be closer to the left where it is like you have like a very specific person or thing in mind, but then you still layer in your own uniqueness, and which probably you have more unique and stronger opinions about something the more time you spend with it. Right. So if you've been like, you know, I know speaking from my own experience, if you've been a hardcore like MMO RPG fan for a long time, you tend to have pretty strong opinions after playing them for 30 years.
Right.
So yeah, that makes sense. Then I guess maybe one way to describe it would be, you know, for starting customer side, it's like you just need to start with one, you know, like Okabe-san, you're saying you started with like one specific friend in mind, you know exactly who they were.
まあそれが運が良ければ
Of course, it's a little bit of a bet, you know, if you try to make something for a friend of yours, like to have them enjoy themselves. If you're lucky, you know, there are a million people just like him who will probably also enjoy it. But if you're very unlucky, then he's the only one that really will enjoy it, right? So, yeah, those unique friends, yeah. So then it doesn't pan out. So, of course, you need to have data to a certain point of like, hey, there are probably more people like my friend here who will probably also enjoy this or have some data regarding that. But of course, it's always a sort of balancing act, because if you go too far, too broad, then you're again in that red ocean with other titles that are very similar, that you're competing with, and where you don't really have that much to bring to the table. So I guess it becomes like some unique thing that hopefully a lot of people will enjoy still, which is, of course, a difficult balancing act.
でこれも
And more maybe not really looking towards users, but more towards the product or the title itself is like the biggest change of like if it's a fun game or it's a not fun game is rather if you have the environment to be able to continue working on it until it becomes fun or until it becomes interesting for people, and so. Because of course that's basically when you work like a big developer like us, it becomes a budget and a time constraint of like up to what point can we push it until it becomes fun. But it's really the challenging part maybe for indie developers as well, is just can I continue working on this until it becomes fun and interesting? Yeah, so and that's just basically what, there's lots of industry news about like budgets becoming very big, of course also from a technical perspective perhaps, but also mainly just because probably they have to spend quite some time just working on making it interesting and making it fun and having the environment and the flexibility to do that. Because of course if you push something out the door of like, well, we ran out of time, it's not really that fun, then you probably won't release a sequel, or there won't be anything else you can do with that later in the future. So that's really maybe what a big lesson for indies could be as well, is just like, can you also work on it until you think it's fun or interesting? Can you bring it up to that point?
例えば私の、カプコンの経験だと
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest point of what Okabe-san has worked on Resident Evil as well as the Devil May Cry franchise, but really the key point becomes the fine-tuning and just making sure that it becomes fun, or like in Resident Evil's case, scary. Because of course you have a lot of horror games and some have jump scares, so it might be a little bit scary, but none of them have been like as fine-tuned perhaps as the Resident Evil games. So there really are, once you have the core of the game in place, there are still like designers constantly fine-tuning, figuring out what works best, or like, oh, if I put a zombie here, then it becomes much scarier. If the player runs out of bullets around this area, then it becomes a lot more intense, so that like when they have to open the next door, they're really going to be scared of what might jump out of them. So they're really fine-tuning constantly. And so when you, for example, look at a work in progress, like as Okabe-san sometimes has the opportunity, like you can tell really fast, even if like all of the assets and like the characters and like the map isn't completely done yet. If that fine-tuning has already been done, you can already tell like, hey, this is already fun to play, or this is already scary, even though half of the assets or the lighting or everything else isn't done yet. So it really becomes a part of that fine-tuning and making sure that it is a fun experience.
なんでプロデューサーとしてはその瞬間、あ、これで売れる。
Yeah, so also when you're a producer, the fun part then of course becomes, you see these moments where, okay, now it's become a product, now it's become a game, now it's become interesting, where you have those little moments where you can see like, we have to, for example, present like internally how the project is going, where you can have a moment like, okay, now I get it, now it has to reach that hurdle of like, is it interesting, is it not interesting, and it has cleared that hurdle, and then you can see, okay, now I have a product. Whether it sells a lot or not, that it's still something else that you need to think about, or whether from a producer perspective how to present it, but at least you have those moments where okay, now we're finally here, now we're at the point where we can start thinking about some of the other elements.
私がそのデビル・メイクライ
When Okabe-san was working on Devil May Cry 5, the team next to him was working on Resident Evil 2, the remake. And so he had a chance to play it a little bit, and he played the opening scene where you're in like the gasoline station. And from that moment, he already was like, okay, this is gonna sell.
Oh, so you like felt the moment.
Yeah, I felt the moment. Or like similar for him when working on Devil May Cry 5, there was this boss battle. That when he was playing that, he also knows, okay, this is gonna sell. So that moment, you really need to have someone who really puts in the effort and does all that fine-tuning, all that balancing to really make it a fun, worthwhile experience.
まあ、バイオ2ので言うともうちょっと細かく
So yeah, to speak more specifically about Resident Evil 2, there was this hallway in the police station in the Resident Evil 2 remake, and when he was walking through that hallway, he was like, okay, yeah, this is really gonna sell. I'm a little bit jealous actually. Yeah.
Yeah, so well. Yeah. So yeah, if you can get one moment off the bat is really strong, but two is.
Yeah.
だからそこはどんなゲームを作る
And of course, if you don't have a moment like that where you feel like, okay, this is really strong, then you probably won't be able to sell to people. So it really becomes a challenge of, can you make something where you can say, okay, no, this is going to sell, this is going to be that moment.
Is that those moments, is there a certain point in the game? Like how do you actually structure that if you're planning it out? Like do you actually, say you're making a game from scratch yourself, do you just start with one moment, or do you look at the opening scene? Like, is there a certain way to think about where to start?
まあ、ゲームによるだろうし、例えばパズルゲームと
Yeah,
かだと
but it simply kind of depends on the title that you're making. Of course, in the case of Capcom, we already have certain franchises, so we already have certain know-how or know like, okay, a Resident Evil title includes this, this, and this, or this has these hurdles that you need to clear. Or in case of Devil May Cry 5, as well as like it has this. If it has this, this, and this, it's probably a Devil May Cry title. And then that moment where it clicked, or like, okay, this is fun, this is interesting, that came kind of later in the process because you probably already had like people modeling and you already had like programmers putting the basic systems in place and so on and so forth. So it comes a little bit later. But of course, if you're making something completely new, then it becomes more important. It's difficult to get funding if you don't know if it's interesting, or you only figure out way later in development. So it comes at a huge risk. So it might make sense to focus on like, what is the core concept that we want to realize with this, and then try to figure out a certain situation or a certain area that you already had in mind where you can realize that, and then fine tuning that and seeing like, okay, this is really the element. Did we make it or did we not make it? Rather,
one thing that we talked about before, but there's obviously a lot of global games come from Japan. People grow up playing games from Japan, but even within the Japanese game developer network and different types of companies, there can be regional differences. Like, games that are maybe made in Osaka maybe feel different or have a different approach than in Tokyo. Would you guys say that's true, or like, would you say there's any sort of different games philosophy to making games between, say, Tokyo, Osaka, or different parts of Japan?
これはもう私の思い込みだけでいく。
Yeah, so what Okabe-san believes is, this might just be his personal belief, so it might not be set in reality, we don't know, but Tokyo is maybe more business-driven, while Kansai area is more from a creator perspective, like, hey, this is what I want to create, and let's just create that. Me personally speaking, I also believe that's more the case. But yeah, I think, how to say, the Kansai area has more of like, anything goes as long as it's interesting, as long as it's fun, which I think is something, not a philosophy that you can really find in Tokyo. So I think it kind of supports that claim, I feel.
でこれを思うもう一つの
When you think about that from like a mobile game perspective as well, it's like, we could be wrong, but we feel that game companies that have huge hits in the mobile space are all based in Tokyo, while in Kansai, we can't really think of any other ones. And mobile and console games are so different. While in console gaming, like the creator is king, and like what do they want to accomplish with the game, it's kind of for the users to try to figure out, or like for the users to have huge respect for the creators. While in mobile gaming, it's all about churning out that data, like figuring out like, hey, this is what you guys want, right? Let's provide what our users want, because our users spend more time here. So if you add something else, so it becomes more data driven and listening to your users, which brings us back to like Tokyo is more business like, and in Kansai it's more like, hey, this is just something that I want to create.
これは私ドラゴンボール的に例え
Yeah, so a very easy example. To tie it to Dragon Ball. So you have Goku's Kamehameha, where he uses his own energy to kind of blast off, which is more of the Kansai way of making things. While mobile is more of like the spirit bomb, where like, hey, everyone, please give me your power. And like in the end, you create something much bigger that appeals to like a broad audience as well. So while of course we are on the Kansai side are more like, oh, we like doing the Kamehameha, so we're just going to do that with our own energy, whether people think or not. So I think maybe that's a good example, to put it.
Yeah. Although Goku also, if he has more time to level up and gain more power, then his Kamehameha also gets more power. That ties to what you were saying earlier about kind of like budgeting. The more runway or time you can allow yourself to make the game, the more tries you get, more people working on it, more minds working on it, lead to powerful energy blasts.
単純にですからお金かかります。
Problem is it costs some money, right? So as long as you have money and time, I think you can create something interesting.
だからもうね、今本当にお金
Yeah, what we've seen in the AAA space as well now is that, of course, we're not saying like, hey, if you just put a big pile of money into it, it'll become interesting. That's not the case, but we are now reaching the era of game development where like an idea is not enough, especially if you're creating a AAA title where like you at least need this amount of money to reach that space of like, hey, this becomes interesting, which is also why we see budgets ballooning in many companies besides your own as well, just to reach that point of until it becomes something interesting and something fun to play.
エントランスフィー
Entrance fee,
フィーみたいな感じでもうそれがもう莫大になったなって感じ。
yeah, so the entrance fees become very expensive to reach that area of like, hey, this is a fun game to play.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I guess traditionally in Japan, how, because like, say in the US, like some of the, the ways that games and especially indies can get funding have shifted a little bit in the last couple of years. We're seeing, obviously, there's still publishers, venture capitalists, VCs, maybe angel investors. Angels, for example, might invest in games that they feel personally connected with or they want to help along, almost like a mentor-mentee relationship. VCs, the business model there is very much like it has to be a big AAA in order to necessitate the large investment that they make. So it has to have very big vision. Usually the ones getting funded last couple of years of like very seasoned teams from well-known publishers. Is that the same in Japan? How traditionally do games get funding in Japan? How does that kind of affect the indie scene here?
正直インディー
Yeah, so we're of course no experts on the indie scene here in Japan particularly, but we see several patterns. So the first one is whether you're already a famous creator or you're not. What happens to these famous creators is they usually get funding from like Chinese or like US based publishers to start there to get out of their current company and create their own studio and work like that, kind of like the VCs I think that you mentioned. And so that's a trend that we've seen a lot here in Japan lately. And then if you're a new creator, rather, or if you don't really have that status, so to speak, then what we see happen is that more trying to do new technologies like Web 3.0, that kind of stuff, the blockchain. If you put that in, like, it's not that they want to create games for the blockchain, but if you add in those buzzwords in your presentation doc, then you'll get 3 times the amount of money compared to like if you wouldn't be able to do that. Same was with VR a couple of years ago. Am I very passionate about making a VR title? Perhaps not, but in order to get funding, I better say that it's a VR title so I can get the funding and move forward that way. So that's the kind of trends that we've been seeing.
Hey everyone, we hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Three Pillars podcast by Conduit and Capcom. As always, if you have any feedback, please email us at podcast@conduit.gg or join the Discord and let us know in the chat. You can find that on our website, conduit.gg. Arigatou gozaimasu, and we'll see you next time.